has the floor.
Ellen had an Achilles injury during her senior year, but kept her sideline for much of the year. She's initially went to Queen's University last year, but missed the sport and decided to transfer to Acadia and try out for their team. Laura Miller, entering Acadia last year, decided to focus on her academics, but realized athletics played a huge role and who she was, and began training to try out for this year's. Kelsey Rice, a star forward with the Dragons, had numerous recruiting opportunities that could have taken her elsewhere, but she decided on Acadia. Believing their days of playing together were done.
Order, please. Time allotted for member statements has expired. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Energy. Mr. Speaker, over 15 months ago, the government announced its ban on onshore gas development here in Nova Scotia. But all that time that has passed, here we are, and people still don't know exactly what the government banned, and we worry the government itself doesn't know what it banned, Mr. Speaker, other than jobs and opportunity and hope in rural areas. Mr. Speaker, the government bill banned high-volume hydraulic fracturing. We're all still waiting to see what that is. I'd like to ask the Minister of Energy, can he share with us today the government's definition of high-volume hydraulic
The Honourable
fracturing?
Minister of Energy.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I want to thank the Leader of the Official Opposition for the question. Since the time that the legislation was brought in, our staff have been working diligently, especially in reaching out to other jurisdictions, both in the United States and here in Canada, that do have hydraulic fracturing taking place, to see exactly what regulatory regime they have, try to learn best practices, working to identify what areas of the province may be suitable for this type of activity. That is work that continues to take place, and be more than happy to provide an update in the very near future.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the government continues to study its navel on this, I regret to report that the unemployment figures are out for today, Mr. Speaker, and it shows an increase in the unemployment rate for Nova Scotia from 7.8% to 8.6%. Sadly, 2,300 jobs have been lost in the last year while the government tries to figure out what it is exactly it banned. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians need jobs. Nova Scotia in rural areas particularly need hope and opportunity from this government. So far, what they've got is a ban on one of the ways that can responsibly turn the rural economy around. While the government thinks about it, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister, will he at least tell Nova Scotians when they will get a definition of high-volume hydraulic fracturing?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, I think what's important to keep in mind here, while the Leader of Official Opposition is focusing on a definition, what we need is a social license. And what we need is that Nova Scotians in the communities where it is deemed that there is a potential hydrocarbons there to allow this activity to take place, that they buy into this, and that the communities say, we're in support of this, we're prepared to have this take place. We are working on establishing the regulatory framework and the definitions. Absolutely, that needs to take place. But I would encourage the member to work with us, and especially due to the fact that a number of his own members live in some of the areas that have been identified as having potential for this industry if we do get that social license. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and I certainly think if it's one that's being done by all sides of the House, then there might be a better chance of seeing it have success in our province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what Nova Scotians need is jobs. What they need is opportunity. What they need is a chance to develop their own resources here at home instead of doing that same work out west, Mr. Speaker. And who knows how many opportunities have been pushed farther and farther away because the government can't provide a definition of what high-volume hydraulic fracturing is. Mr. Speaker, other provinces and states are moving ahead. Small towns are repopulating. Rural schools are becoming more effective and sustainable, Mr. Speaker, because they have done their homework, but this government does not. They don't even meet their own deadline. They told Nova Scotians they would have this settled by the end of 2014. It's almost the end of 2015, Mr. Speaker. Why did the government miss its own deadline for a definition by almost a year?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, again, it's important to keep in mind that this is an industry that Nova Scotians, like so many others around the province, not only in our province but in Canada and the United States, have expressed concerns about. So it's not as cut and dry as Leader of the Official Opposition would like to suggest. At the same time, we don't want to create false hope, because even if the industry were given a green light to proceed, it could take years before there would be the significant amount of employment levels that he's mentioned. Speaker, the fact is, when you look at British Columbia, for example, having met with their Minister of Natural Resources and trying to understand how is it that British Columbia has a successful fracturing industry for so many years, and his response was quite interesting, because he said, well, we have a social license to do oil and gas development onshore. If we talk about our offshore, it's a non-starter with the residents of our province. So Nova Scotia is almost the exact opposite in that we've had a very successful history of offshore oil and gas development. We have work that remains to be done to have Nova Scotians give us a social license to do onshore development.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. In the spring budget, the Liberal government cut the budget of $3.6 million from the operating budget of long-term care facilities. And now we have a memo that shows just how much each facility has been cut, Mr. Speaker, and I'll table that information. The operating budget for Melville Lodge was cut by over $145,000. Ocean View Manor saw their operating budget cut by $105,000. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister of Health explain why he has cut the operating budgets of 63 out of the 87 nursing homes in the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite knows, we are in fact putting more and more money into home care, but we also had a number of our long-term care nursing homes that in fact were well above the average for the province, and it was an opportunity for all to take a look at how they could in fact create greater efficiencies within their nursing homes, and I know that is in fact taking place across the province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, people are still living in long-term care facilities, calling that home. They should have invested in home care first, Mr. Speaker, to limit the amount of individuals in Nova Scotia going into our facilities, not the other way around, Mr. Speaker. The list of nursing home and residential care facilities that I just tabled, Mr. Speaker, affecting communities across this province. Wolfville Nursing Home cut by $74,000, St. Vincent Nursing Home by $89,000, Villa Cadien by $50,000, Mahone Nursing Home by $67,000, and the list goes on and on and on. Can the Minister of Health tell us the impact these cuts to their operating budgets have had to long-term care facilities and the Nova Scotians that they serve?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What the member opposite fails to point out is that we now have $567 million going into long-term care, and last year we actually increased the budget by $6.9 million. While there were some mitigations that were taking place, there was actually an overall increase. One little segment of their budget did in fact have some mitigations take place. This in no way. I've been in 25 of our nursing homes since budget day, and this has not impacted the quality of care in our nursing homes.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know when the last time the minister visited a nursing home or talked to the staff or the residents or their families, I wonder if he'd have a different answer, Mr. Speaker. The list I tabled of the nursing home and residential care, Mr. Speaker, I would like to table a letter from the President of Northwood Care. Hundreds of seniors in Halifax and Bedford call Northwood Care their home, and they've already had cut their administration budget to bare bones, Mr. Speaker, and the planned savings were meant to go to improve frontline care, Mr. Speaker. So I'm wondering if the minister could answer the question of why is balancing the budget the priority and not the quality of health care being provided to our most vulnerable Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. These cuts have had an impact on those services.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Look, any time we get a change in how much money a facility is going to have to operate, it does cause initially some alarm and some wonderment. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had a wonderful time visiting, first of all, patients, also staff at Glenhaven, and the message that the supervisor there, the CEO of the site, gave me is that we can make further cuts and not impact quality care.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. On August 3rd, the mental health unit at the Aberdeen Hospital was closed, causing many residents in need of Pictou County scrambling as far away as Yarmouth to get the help that they require. They were assured by the Minister of Health that this was a short-term closure and that it would be reopened within 90 days, which would be November 3rd, Mr. Speaker. It's now well into December. That unit is still not open, and reports are reaching us, Mr. Speaker, that in fact the beds at that unit are being converted into administrative offices. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, are those mental health unit beds at the Aberdeen being changed over to administrative offices, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that the Provincial Health Authority has the responsibility for operations across the province. And what I know is that, in fact, the word from that community, from those clinicians that are providing mental health care, in fact, the service is stronger today than it was a year ago.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that answer will be cold comfort to the people suffering from mental illness in Pictou County that took him at his word that those beds would be reopened, Mr. Speaker. That answer was not a yes or a no, and I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, how symbolic of this government's failure in health care, in mental health, if they're adding administrative offices where the mental health unit beds used to be. So I hope we get a straight answer from the minister on that question, because it's very important. So I'll ask him a follow-up question. Will he assure the people that he told that that would be a short-term closure, that those beds on that exact site will reopen as he promised?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I know is that when I speak with the provincial team and now the provincial lead in mental health, Dr. Corey, I know that there has been recruitment problems. We know that in the new emergency department at the Aberdeen, there will be direct triaging of those who are experiencing episodic mental health events or in trauma, and I know that there is a path to improve services that are already being strongly delivered in Pictou County.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister in charge of the Film and Television Incentive Fund. In November, we heard testimony at the Economic Development Committee from Scott Simpson with Screen Nova Scotia. Mr. Simpson said there were two significant issues with the new fund, in addition to the cap on it. The loss of the equity program and the percentage or level of the incentive fund itself, and I will table that. So I'd like to ask the Minister, when will these issues be solved or resolved?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. There's been tremendous work done with the film industry over the last several months. Representatives of the film industry have worked and engaged government and department representatives They've advanced a number of areas that we believe are helpful to the industry. And 3 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, we announced around $500,000 in support to the industry itself. They're focused on a strategic plan, Mr. Speaker. They've asked for a state-of-the-art web portal specific to location services. They've talked about marketing and promotion, and they've talked about additional support, Mr. Speaker, in full-time equivalents, and we've provided that to the industry, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering about a cap, though. Mr. Speaker, Screen Nova Scotia film and TV producers and IATSE have all stated that they need the cap on the new Film Incentive Fund lifted to remove the cloud of uncertainty that's hanging over the industry. On November 20th, I asked the minister when he will lift the cap, but he didn't answer the question, and I will table that answered. On November 27th, I asked the minister again, but he didn't answer, and I will table that answered. Perhaps the third time's a charm, Mr. Speaker. When will the minister lift the cap to ensure more Nova Scotians aren't left packing their bags and heading for film work out west?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know optimism and progressive work obviously is not something that my colleague understands. I don't know how many times I have to repeat it in this House. We've worked close with the industry. They've asked us. We've asked them for their priorities. We've responded and addressed their priorities. And I want to table, Mr. Speaker. An article published in the Metro on August the 31st, 2015. Titled, Nova Scotia Film Industry Gives Up on Pushing Government to Reverse Tax Decision. Mark Allman, the Executive Director, Chair of the Board for Screen Nova Scotia, said himself, we're not looking to have that returned. We're trying to move forward. I wish my colleague would look at moving forward.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. I actually can't believe my ears from his answer earlier. He wants to pass everything on to the new health authority, but nobody elected them to be on top of these things, Mr. Speaker. They elected the Minister of Health. I asked him just to confirm, very simply, whether that mental health unit at the Aberdeen Hospital is being changed over to administrative officers or not, and he has not answered the question. So I was going to ask him simply, does he even know if those mental health beds are being converted to offices?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just a little over a week ago, I met with Dr. Corey, who is now heading mental health services in our regional hospitals across the province. I met with Dr. Vino from Pictou, and at that point in time, there hadn't been a final decision made on what exactly there would be in terms of care around the short-term psychiatric unit. But what I can offer the Leader of the Opposition is that next week I will make a very clear statement on what is happening at the Aberdeen.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is a very important question. It goes to the heart of mental health service in Pictou County. If the minister knows what is going on with that mental health unit, he should just tell us when he's asked in this House today and not save it for some time next week, Mr. Speaker. That's the problem with a government that tries to point the finger at someone else when they are the ones responsible for making sure mental health services are provided across this province. Mr. Speaker, today we know of people that go to that short-stay unit and are told to go to Yarmouth if they want help. If the Minister of Health truly believes that mental health services are in good shape in Pictou County, will he explain how going to Yarmouth is better than having the short-stay unit open like he promised?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what the Leader of the Opposition is pointing out here is in fact only a very, very small part of the picture about the mental health unit at the Aberdeen. We are starting to do something very positive, very constructive for both mental health and medical issues across the province. We are getting patients where they need treatment in as timely a manner as possible. We're operating as one strong system. system. This is what the member opposite fails to see.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, and this question is, of course, dealing with the delivery of health care services to not only mental health patients, but 46,000 residents in Pictou County. Mr. Speaker, traditionally the month of December has always been a very busy time for the mental health unit. With this unit closed, New Glasgow police officers often are required to travel to different locations. And as was mentioned earlier in the House today, we see police officers taken off their normal routine of the day. Not just one police officer, Mr. Speaker, but two traveling to places like Truro, Yarmouth. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister. Did the Minister provide within his budget an allocation to cover this additional cost?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I guess I would have to refer part of that question to the Minister of Justice. It is, in fact, a policing issue, and I know that as she backgrounds in the department, she has a very good handle, in fact, on what is happening with policing across the province.
The Honourable Minister of Justice. Or the Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the 8-bed mental health unit closed on August the 3rd. I believe the Minister said yesterday and also today that the mental health services are better now than they were a year ago. With all due respect to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, he must be listening to hospital personnel, because that's what we are hearing from. That's not what we're hearing from patients and families. And Mr. Speaker, I've done a bit of research and have talked to some of these families that need these services. For example, Bobby Brooks was forced to drive to Yarmouth. This is one example of many. Iron Limburg is another resident that relies heavily on this assistance. When someone is facing a suicidal crisis, they need immediate mental health treatment and family support. My question to the Minister, will the 8-bed mental health unit at the Aberdeen Hospital reopen soon?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I know is that as part of the clinical services review, we know that we must have the strongest health care delivery, whether it's mental health or the medical health of residents of Nova Scotia. And we know that there was a very needed review of what was taking place at the Aberdeen, but there will be a very clear picture for the future of mental health services that the residents of Pictou County will in fact be able to see very shortly.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. When asked for an update on the province's coverage of at-home oral cancer medication, the Minister said the cost would be in the range of $40 to $50 million. And he stated he was looking for help from the federal government, and that was some time ago, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister, if the new federal government does not come through with the National Pharmacare Plan or catastrophic drug coverage plan this winter, will the Minister fully fund take-home oral cancer medication this spring?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I'm pleased to say is that we finally have a federal government that's going to involve ministers of health across the country in very strong discussions. First of all, of course, in January, they will open the health accord, and we will get, as ministers, an opportunity to talk about priorities, and I'll certainly be bringing those to the national table. We know that oral cancer drugs very, very important to Nova Scotians. Our family pharmacare, senior pharmacare currently do a great job in providing the vast majority of assistance for those patients.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
I hope the federal government does help out, Mr. Speaker, because the minister definitely needs a lot of support when it comes to healthcare delivery in Nova Scotia. Healthcare delivery is primarily a provincial responsibility. That's a point raised quite strongly in a letter that I'll table from Deborah Maskins on behalf of the Can Certainty Coalition, which represents over 35 Canadian cancer organizations. She indicated over a year ago, on October 15, 2014, the minister was on CBC saying that he was addressing the delays and difficulties for Nova Scotia cancer patients in accessing take-home cancer drugs. Tragically, Mr. Speaker, several of the patients who spoke to the media at that time are too unwell, and some have actually passed away, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the minister, cancer patients deserve a clear answer. How long is the minister prepared to wait on the federal government to come through with a plan to support these Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I'm pleased to say is that we currently provide over $10 million for oral cancer drugs in the province. We are part of a number of ways to assist cancer patients. This is a new reality that, in fact, we are facing right across the country, where more and more oral cancer drugs are becoming available. It will be one of those discussion areas that we will have with the national government, and we hope that there will, in fact, be a better day, more certainty in terms of that coverage for the future.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Labour and Workforce Development. In all the years that I've been in this House, Mr. Speaker, there's been much discussion on jobs, the lack of jobs, young people leaving for other parts of the country and the world, for that matter. And I wonder what the Minister and her department are doing to better that situation.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We actually have a number of things that are underway. I would point to the recent announcement from the Public Service Commission around hiring young people and doing away with the requirements for experience. We're working on increasing co-op opportunities across the province. We're also working on transformation of our Careers Nova Scotia system here in the province, because one of the things we know is that 45% of the young people who leave this province do so because they can't see reaching their career goals staying here in Nova Scotia. So we're working on that as we speak. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's answer. We hear this morning about the numbers yet again, with regards to unemployment. I also know it's a seasonal time of year. Some of that probably has an impact, Mr. Speaker, but I also come from a rural area of this province where there are a number of people unemployed, constantly looking to better themselves and to find work, and a lot of people do travel back and forth, which is, as we all know, it's been a hard situation for families. So time is of the essence, Mr. Speaker, and I wonder if the Minister could speak. She detailed a fair bit in her answer. I wonder if she could speak to a time frame where we may see some results from what it is this department is doing.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. For example, the Careers Nova Scotia transformation is underway. We are in the process of rolling that out, and just to acquaint the honourable members with the current situation, the responsibility for Careers Nova Scotia was given to us from the federal government in 2009. It's a $23 million system, and the way it's set up right now, it's not working. We have 90% of job seekers don't actually know that they can go to a Careers Nova Scotia centre for assistance, and employers don't know either. We have some terrific people working in the system, and we just need to give them the opportunity to make sure this is distributed equitably around the province to rural areas where there is often not a lot of coverage. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. The short-stay unit at the Aberdeen Hospital closed on August 3rd. I'm hearing from many constituents that believe that the services that are being provided to residents of Pictou County are less than they were before that time, that there are not as many services available to the people of the county
as there were before. So I think I've heard the minister say a couple times that the people of Pictou County are getting better service over the last 3 months than they ever have. And I'd just like the minister to clarify that. Does the minister really believe that the people of Pictou County are getting better mental health services today than they did just 3 months ago when they had the short stay unit?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the honourable member has done some full research, not just on the Aberdeen, but on maybe perhaps some mental health treatment. We know that putting a person in a bed only is not the final answer. We need strong psychiatrists, psychologists, and people that we need to be able to get in place at certain times. Recruitment is very often difficult, especially in this time of the year, as people usually go with a school year when they'll make a move. And we know that recruitment is in fact still going on. But when I hear from the top people delivering psychiatric services in Pictou County, they talk about having moved in a more positive direction.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with all due respect to the minister, I believe if you ask somebody if you think they're doing a good job, they're likely to tell you that they are. If you ask the people who are receiving the services, you might receive a different answer, Minister, and I would encourage you to try and talk to some of those people who are relying on the services. And since you brought up recruitment, I would like to revisit recruitment.
Order, please. I just want to quickly remind the honourable member not to refer to members opposite directly. Keep your questions through the chair. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I apologize for that. I would ask you to encourage the minister to speak to the people that are actually wanting to receive the services. But in terms of recruitment, we know that the minister met with people up there as recently as a week ago, but he came back and said recruitment never came up. And yet the main message to the people of the county is we can't recruit. So the minister goes to the county, doesn't talk about recruiting. People on site are telling me job postings go up and down as many as 4 times. They were down last week. The minister says now they're back up. So is this a staffing issue or not?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Staffing is certainly part of the issue at the Aberdeen or for services throughout Pictou County. But he knows as well as all Nova Scotians that the delivery of mental health services are in fact community-based. And having the right number of providers in a community is the goal of the provincial health authority. We're going through clinical services review and having the appropriate mental health services in the right centres and the right amount, in fact, is what is being accomplished.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. In 2013, the government established a committee to transform the Services to Persons with Disabilities program. Members of the disability community, service providers and others developed a document that has become known as the roadmap that represented transformational change. The roadmap, I gather, has been removed from the government website. Is the minister still committed to implementing the roadmap as the committee envisioned it?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we are. We came into office in October of 2013. The roadmap had been adopted 2 months previously by the previous government. We're committed to the roadmap, and I understand the frustration of families who feel we're not moving quickly enough. I have often said from the outset that this would be a decade-long process as we reduce reliance on larger facilities and move folks with very complex and unique needs into the community of their choice. That we have to make sure that we do that safely and securely and responsibly. We know there are other jurisdictions in Canada who have not done that in a safe way, and there's been dire consequences to that, and I'm committed to that not happening in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
In a recent information session, service providers learned about modifications the Liberal government is making to work identified in the roadmap. Some were surprised to learn that in some cases the modification meant doing the exact opposite of what the roadmap intended. Does the minister believe the department's modification of the roadmap recommendations still are true to the original document?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
As we talked to families throughout the province and from one end to the other, it was clear that some of the commitments of the roadmap, particularly around moving everyone from larger facilities, there are many families that have come forward and said they would rather their loved ones remain in larger facilities, and we have to respect that choice. We have to respect that. But what I have committed to is that as of June 2016, there will be no new permanent placements in larger facilities. I've stopped renovations and expansion of larger facilities, and you can talk to your colleague in front of you who's glaring at me. But we're committed to the roadmap, and we will continue to be committed to that roadmap.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we seem to be on a roll here. We heard last week that the Women's Employment Outreach Centre in HRM, which has provided counselling and employment services to women for over 35 years, will be closing this summer because the provincial government has cut its funding. We've also heard that the pending closure of the Ann Terry Project, which has provided similar services for women in Cape Breton for 3 decades, will also be forced to possibly close, as their executive director told the CBC yesterday about her dealings with the government, and I quote, "Did they listen to what we had to say? There are only 2 women's services across the province. It would appear to me that they didn't." So my question, Mr. Speaker, is for the minister responsible for the status of women. Was she or the Advisory Council of Women consulted before the decision was made to close the only women's employment centres in the province?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I'll defer to my colleague, the Minister of Labour, in advance.
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As I was indicating earlier, we have a patchwork of centres across the province. We don't have equitable distribution of our services across the province. At this time, there are only 2 centres for women. What we would like to see is that the services that they provide and that they work with their other service providers in their areas to actually expand that across the given area. There is a place for them in this system. At the end of the day, and I want to be very clear, I have not cut any funding. No decisions have been made. They may have made a decision with their board that they don't want to participate, but I would hope that they would. My understanding is that WEO is planning to participate in helping to roll out across other areas, but that they may in fact close their centre, but we have not. And I want to be very clear about that. We have not closed any centre.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, actually, I said that the funding has been cut and they'll have to close. Mr. Speaker, not only are the 2 women's... Mr. Speaker? Excuse me? Get a hearing aid, I heard. Wow, that's really nice. As I said, there's a lot of low blows going on here today, Mr. Speaker, and yesterday. Not only are there 2 women's centres...
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River has the floor.
Thank you. It's quite amazing how rude.
Does the member have a question?
I sure do. Not only are there 2 women's employment centres in the province slated to close, but we're also hearing today that Our Time Cafe, which provides concrete job experience for women facing homelessness or have been involved with the justice system, is also losing funding because of the government's new policies. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to know, is the minister responsible for the status of women supportive of her government's decision to cut funding for the Our Time Cafe, which is operated by the Elizabeth Fry Society?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I want to be very clear here. There's a $23 million budget for the delivery of employment assistance services across this province. That budget remains intact. We have not closed anyone at all in terms. And yeah, actually, it was the question. It was you asked if we had cut their funding. We did not cut their funding.
Order, please. I'd like to remind the Honourable Minister of Labour not to refer to members opposite directly. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
In terms of our Time Cafe, they were alerted in January that under the new terms of the Canada Job Fund, which is a federal program that gives us money, the federal government, the then federal government, cut the funding that is available for programs like theirs, and we can no longer, unfortunately, offer core funding to a program like that. I have a high regard for that particular organization, and I am very unhappy. Unfortunately, we do not. Well, we could actually, we could continue to give them core funding, the honourable member for Sackville, but then that would mean that we would have to cut other funding to other organizations.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Tourism. People working at visitor information centres are well trained, they have experience. I know in the Port Hastings Visitor Information Centre, last summer alone they counselled about 75,000 visitors. Now, yesterday the Minister had said that all 51 municipalities will have visitor information centres, but he did not confirm support for provincial visitor information centres like Port Hastings. Mr. Speaker, these people have lives, they've got bills to pay, they have decisions to make. If the government's intention is not to reopen these visitor centres in the spring, why are they stringing along these people for months to come?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Mr. Speaker, one of the most important things that Tourism Nova Scotia has undertaken is community dialogue. And they've reached out to stakeholders in both Port Hastings and other communities around the province who have provincial VICs. That dialogue continues. We want to ensure that it's exhaustive, that it's thorough, and it addresses the objectives of Tourism Nova Scotia and their requirement to double revenues in tourism over the next 10 years.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's always consultation going on in the tourism industry. In fact, I have a stack of letters from people who have visited the province, people who were appreciative of the service they got at the Visitor Information Centre in Port Hastings, people who valued the service they received there. So, Mr. Speaker, the question is, why didn't the government let workers know in August if their intention is to close these visitor centres? These people were in the civil service until September, and they could have applied as internal candidates for jobs in other departments.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Let me be clear, there's been no decisions made yet, Mr. Speaker, and until decisions are made, it would be inappropriate and premature to share or to tell people that they've been impacted. No decisions have been made, and I indicated to my colleague earlier in the week, when a decision is made, we will clearly communicate that both to my colleagues in the House and employees within Tourism Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, a very small part of the health and wellness budget goes towards proactive efforts to improve people's health. But an even smaller part under this government with the apparent elimination of the Recreation Facility Development Program. Mr. Speaker, and that's coming up in 2016-17. So, Mr. Speaker, has the Minister of Health changed his mind on this matter, or is the government choosing to invest less in proactive measures that improve people's health?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the member opposite knows, I don't have to deliver any speech here in the House today on how important preventive and proactive measures are needed to in fact balance health care with the health of Nova Scotians. And first of all, I'm pleased to say that our new Nova Scotia Health Authority has started to engage Nova Scotians on speaking about health and supporting health, of course, our recreation facilities, and there will be recreation grants in the 2016-2017 budget year.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is positive, and I hope that that is the case, and I hope that that program is funded the way it's been funded, at least in the past. Mr. Speaker, this is about wellness. It's about investing today in people's health to save money that will have to be spent tomorrow in our health care system if that doesn't happen. So, Mr. Speaker, can the minister answer why the government is not issuing applications for the RFD program to all the ball fields, the rinks, the community centres and other organizations who depend on this funding?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps the member has done a bit of research in this area. We've had, in fact, over the years, not any one, government or department's, responsibility as to why things happened as they did, but we've had some organizations receiving 3 and 4 different grants through different departments. We're taking a look at how we can grow and improve community facilities, and we will have grant programs. It's just that we're committed to doing a better job.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, thousands of Nova Scotians and their families rely on the care they receive from long-term care facilities across the province, and a cut to their operating budget has an impact on how they provide that care, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the minister, how much is the minister prepared to cut on with the budgets to those long-term care facilities across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite knows, if he had left the state of the books of the province in better shape, we in fact wouldn't have had to go through the kind of mitigations that had been required last year. In fact, having been in about 20 nursing homes since April 1st, there has been very little comment about having to absorb some dollars and do things differently. That's what strong administration, strong leadership that is in our nursing homes. That's what we have in our nursing homes, and they're prepared to work with government to make sure that they're there for the future.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Well, that's a load of baloney, Mr. Speaker. I know right now, Mr.
Order,
Speaker.
please. I'd like to remind the honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid that I'm pretty sure a load of baloney is unparliamentary. So I'll look it up just to be sure and get back to you. But the honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
I do retract that. It's a load of something, Mr. Speaker. I know that much because we've seen $9 million wasted in the amalgamation of the District Health Authority that could have went in to expanding long-term care facilities, expanding home care. $9 million plus, and we know it's going to go even higher, Mr. Speaker, as they finish calculating how much the amalgamation just cost taxpayers in Nova Scotia. So I'd like to ask the minister, if he was responsible, has he evaluated the impact the cuts to the long-term care facilities have had with the budget cuts they seen last year? Will he commit to doing evaluation if he hasn't?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd love to take the next half hour and talk about the strengths and talk about the strengths of the one provincial health authority that minister and that government never had the courage to do. I know the strength of the one provincial health authority, but here's the measure. Here's the measure, Mr. Speaker, of what's going on.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
here's the measure of what's happening in our long-term care homes. Just a few weeks ago, I was in St. Vincent Nursing Home, and what were they putting on the table that day and that week? Locally grown food, Mr. Speaker. High quality food for the patients in that home. And so I think he has some missing facts in his premise.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. I've recently been contacted by a group of parents in the Windsor-West Hants area, Mr. Speaker, with regards to an early immersion French program in our elementary schools. We have written a letter to the AVRSP and specifically Mr. Dave Jones, which I will table a copy of, Mr. Speaker. There are only two elementary schools that provide this program for early, losing my train of thought already. Early French immersion, Mr. Speaker, in the Valley. And I wonder, how do we go about getting that in the Windsor area for these parents that are interested?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the member for the question, and thank you to the member for working through the school advisory councils, because I think it's important for parents in the communities to know that they have a voice and how they can bring their concerns forward. And one of those avenues to get their voices heard is through their school advisory council. But I would say to the member, it's also important, I think, for the parents to go to their local school board member to raise that at the board table, because the decision about offering French immersion or other programs is a decision that's made by the board. There is federal funding that comes through our department, which boards can apply for if they're setting up a new French immersion class. That funding, special projects funding, will fund one FTE to begin the process of delivering a French immersion program to the students. And I would encourage the member to work and to ask his parents and his constituents to work through school advisory council and the board. The board makes a decision, but they need to be reminded that there are funds available from the federal government through our department with start-up costs for those French immersion classes.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I stand on a point of sanctimonious order, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister for the Public Service Alliance indicates, and I will call that minister out. Mr. Speaker, during question period, when one of the members of this caucus was asking a question, I heard, and I think other members heard, someone from the government side yell out, "Get a hearing aid." And Mr. Speaker, I think if that is not unparliamentary, it certainly is a great insult to those who have hearing loss, Mr. Speaker, and it's an inappropriate comment to make in this assembly, Mr. Speaker, and I would ask that you review the tape and make a decision, Mr. Speaker.
I will take that under advisement and report back. The Honourable Member for Kings North. Order, please.